Okay. So before we get into today's stuff, well, I guess we're always in today's stuff, but I want to recap a little bit the race and where we've been in this unit. Just kind of give us a big picture overview on this part two, unmasking the structures of power, which we decided to say was the roots of power. And we began with a chapter on race and racism. And it struck me that by beginning with a chapter on race and racism, it's kind of like, I mean, I guess when I see the word race and racism, I automatically think bad. Racism is bad, right? I mean, I think we should think that. I don't think I think it's a good thing to think racism is bad. So this is where Guest begins. He tells us that, in this sort of pairing here, where you have the idea of race, but then you're immediately pairing it with racism, and so I think at least most normal people's reaction is going to be, okay, race and racism. Well, we're going to find out why that's bad. And I mean, I guess what was striking to me as we talked about is that anthropology once sort of owned the concept of race. And I mean that we were the ones who people went to find out about race. And especially when we think about how anthropologists, especially biological anthropologists, uh, sort of questioned the notion of race, certainly questioned the idea that one race was inferior or superior to the others. And in some ways, the whole enterprise of anthropology, the whole enterprise of cultural anthropology was launched against these deterministic ideas of race and hierarchical racism in US society. And, I think that I'm not sure that anthropology owned the idea of racism too, but we were pretty prominent in that. As I mentioned, like Martin Luther King Jr. quoted anthropologists. So some people even credit certain anthropologists with the invention of the term racism. But instead of kind of continuing along those lines, anthropology moved into ethnicity. And we kind of, in some ways, a lot of anthropologists did basically say, well, race is not biologically real and racism is bad, but ethnicity, this sort of cultural thing that we're going to do, is okay because that's what we do and that's what we study is ethnicity. And so we kind of moved into this next part of the chapter, or I mean, the next part of Guest, which would be ethnicity. And I started wondering, well, what if Guest kept up his chapter titles to make it, we all kind of also think that ethnocentrism is bad. Maybe not as bad as racism, but most of us in an anthropology class would be like, oh yeah, I'm not supposed to be ethnocentric either. I know everybody is a little bit ethnocentric, and we all have to be ethnocentric in order to get by. But what I'm kind of getting at is, what if instead of doing his ethnicity and nationalism, which he did ethnicity and ethnocentrism, and we deconstructed ethnicity in some of the ways that we did. We said, well, this is not a primordial identity. And in fact, we want to avoid being ethnocentric, which would be an interesting tactic to take. But we can't really do that in anthropology so much because we've decided that ethnicity is okay, or at least worthy of our attention and studying. As you know, what we did is we paired that with nationalism. Now, we weren't quite sure, and in the nationalist class, I think I remember saying something along the lines of ethnicity and nationalism are neither inherently good nor bad. We just have to analyze their potentially good and bad effects. Now, of course, I would never say the same thing about racism, right? I would never tell you, well, racism is neither inherently good or bad. We just have, no, I mean, that would be ridiculous. Can't even believe I just said that on a recording, right? But with nationalism, it's kind of, we don't know about it. We're trying to analyze it. And we're shifting here, you'll notice, towards a more analytical frame. So it has a little bit less, I mean, we certainly can talk about the bad effects of nationalism, but we wouldn't want to say it's automatically bad or automatically terrible. Ah, I want to pause here for a second because it's October 12th, also known as Columbus Day, also known as Indigenous Peoples Day. I want to talk about the Columbus Day part of it because it sort of helps us encapsulate these last two chapters. So today's Columbus Day. And here we are, sadly, in this class, just being here. Um, Columbus Day is an interesting holiday. Like Thanksgiving, it was not celebrated ever since Columbus landed. So, in fact, for a couple hundred years, people pretty much forgot about Columbus. Nobody really knew who he was. I mean, you might learn about the voyages of Columbus, and maybe if you were in a certain place in Spain or something, you'd celebrate a little bit about it, but it wasn't a it wasn't seen as anything that was controversial. He wasn't seen either as a hero or as a villain. It was just, somebody who happened to stumble across some, oh well, I mean, old telling, an explorer, right? So, but it wasn't a holiday. It wasn't celebrated at all. Like I said, for a couple hundred years, people pretty much forgot about Columbus. Wasn't known at all. Columbus Day enters into the American holiday system in an interesting way because, it started out with some people in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, around there, around 100 years ago, and especially got going in sort of 1892, in which Spain also was kind of down on its luck as a country and needed a kind of celebration of its own nationalism. And so they wanted to celebrate the 400th year. So 1892 became important. But in the United States, which obviously was not Spain and was not Latin America, the key constituencies arguing or sort of marching for a Columbus Day celebration were the Italian Americans, which of course might seem a little bit obvious because, Columbus technically came from Genoa or somewhere. I mean, he would not have considered himself to be an Italian, I don't think would be his, there wasn't really, like I said, there wasn't really a country of a nation like that. But anyway, Italian immigrants in the Americas, and curiously, the Irish, who were perhaps more important, or more important than the Italians in helping us get Columbus Day started. Now you might wonder, what do the Irish have to do with this? What do they have to? They're way up there in the north. Why are the Irish and the Italians getting together around Columbus Day? And the key part of this is actually Catholicism. So the Irish and the Italians were seen as suspicious for a number of reasons. As we talked about, both of them weren't seen as entirely or completely accepted into the white category, but they were also suspicious because they were Catholics. And so the idea was that they didn't have an allegiance to the country or to the nation or to the United States. They didn't have an allegiance. Their allegiance was to Rome because they were papists. They were Catholics. And so they didn't fit into the WASP, or the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant category. They were a little too Catholic to be national. Now, by celebrating Columbus, what the Irish and the Italians were able to do was to uphold Columbus as this figure of civic virtue. And so Columbus was kind of their entryway into using this ethnic identity and this religious identity in order to claim that they too could be nationalists. They too could be part of the country. In some ways, it was their ticket into claiming whiteness as well, because they were then able to fully participate, or they hoped to fully participate in the United States. And so, I mean, even as late as 1960, with John F. Kennedy, the first Catholic president, there were people who were like, no, he can't be the president. That's not right. He's still going to have allegiance to the Pope, have allegiance to Rome. He shouldn't be the president because of that. So, there's this interesting kind of thing that happens, and a lot of people these days you may have noticed people get upset about Columbus Day and we shouldn't celebrate it. And so, we should call it Indigenous Peoples Day instead. And then, you might be living in a town, this happens to people, where there's like a large Irish American population, and they get really upset when people talk about eliminating Columbus Day. You're like, what's up with that? What do the Irish have to do with this? What difference does it make to them? Well, it goes back to this. I mean, this was a ticket into being American, being white, and being able to be nationalist. So when you think about sort of, like I said, the grenade that is ethnicity and nationalism sometimes, it certainly can explode around issues like Columbus Day if that's been your entry into a different kind of citizenship. So how did that get in there? Oh, I know. What I wanted to say is that one of the things that we talked about, which is very important, is the idea of not just individual racism, but institutional racism, or what we sometimes call structural racism. And what I wanted to say is that in some ways, because anthropology kind of moved over into ethnicity and nationalism and those kinds of questions, although some anthropologists have been important in terms of talking about institutional racism, this is not something that anthropology has really been able to put across to people. It's not something that we've been able to communicate very well or even be very good at presenting. And so, in some ways, the anthropological insights about racism have been lost or are not very well articulated, like I said, in part because we concentrated so much on ethnicity and nationalism and those kinds of questions. I wondered here, we now move into the chapter on gender. And I guess if we were to keep going with our titling, now we drop down to a one-word title. We used to have race and racism, then we had ethnicity and nationalism. I said if we kept going with our if our bad thing, it would be ethnicity and ethnocentrism. And of course, here we could retitle this chapter. Instead, we could call it gender and sexism, right? I mean, that'd be a good thing to do. Then it would be apparent that, what we were doing was talking about the construction of gender, how gender is not sort of primordial or given for all eternity, and also the power aspect, the sexism aspect. But instead, we just have gender. Just old gender. We're going to be reading about gender today and sexuality for chapter 8 on Wednesday. And I guess it's kind of my opinion that these should be one chapter. I'm kind of mystified by how we got 2 chapters out of this. So we'll just read one for today and one for Wednesday. So a little bit of background into the gender and sexuality stuff. Anthropology, in the early years of anthropology, we did a lot of work on kinship. And that's what we'll be doing in chapter 9. So next week, we'll be talking about kinship and family and marriage in anthropology. And as I'll talk to you about, this was kind of one of the founding building blocks of anthropology, to the extent that people laughed at us and called us kinshipology. But it wasn't until the late 1960s and 1970s that the feminists and especially the feminist anthropologists got into this material and started to say, hey, wait a second. This kinship and gender, this kinship stuff that you've been doing actually can tell us a lot about gender relationships and a lot about sexuality. So anthropology, you were studying this, or there's insights that you have, although they were all done from this weird male bias perspective, but the feminists really kind of ran with that and were able to take some of these earlier anthropological studies and tell us a lot more about gender. And so that in recent years, so remember how we talked about anthropology had sort of dropped the ball on talking about race and racism. It'd be nice to have that ball back, you know. It'd be lovely to get a little get a little insight on that these days. But in the last, I would say, decade or so, uh, people have really gotten excited about anthropological comments on gender and sexuality. Did you just write that down, Caitlin? That it made anthropology lit? Oh, good, good. I'm glad you stopped. Yes. You shouldn't just write down what's, somebody told me this was a cool thing to say a while back, so I used it. So it's made anthropology popular. People come to us for stuff these days. And we might wonder, well, what is it about the gender and sexuality stuff in anthropology and both in society that makes us popular these days? Oh yes, this is fascinating to me. As some of you who went to the discussion board, if you type into your phones, just try typing in www.anthropology with a y.com, and you will instead end up at this store, which I don't know if any of you have ever been to an anthropologie store, the French word for anthropologie, but in this store, you can find stuff like this, mostly women's clothes. So I don't know how they bought anthropology. It's always been fascinating to me how they got us. But they got us, they found us, and instead of you will not find, you know, the discipline of anthropology, you will find the store of anthropology and people like this, gazing at you from the wide open field, almost like they're doing field work or something, right? You know, you can see this kind of like, you know, the field work chic here. Maybe we should go with this. I think this might be my new advertising brand right here. You be an anthropology major and you too can be leaning against a post with rocks in the background. Doesn't that look great? I think they're selling that puffy jacket there. Anyway, it prompted me to ask, some of you responded, if anthropology had somehow become coded as basically gendered as female. And two of you said, no, it's neutral. Anthropology is neutral. It's gender neutral. It's just a discipline. But I say to you, if that's so, how come there are only 10% of you that are males in this class? Or at least I think of as self-identifying males. You know, why is that so? Somebody went and got the statistics for PhDs. I think it's about 2/3 female right now for PhD holders. So at the very top of anthropology, at the sort of old professor level, it is still a male-dominated, predominantly male discipline. But as you go down the ranks, new PhDs, undergraduates, you know, it gets more female as you go it gets more gendered as female. And I'm not sure why. I don't know exactly why that happened, but there's my evidence right there. So let's get into the gender chapter. Are men and women born or made? Born or made? I don't know why I did that. Because it's goofy. What a stupid question to ask. Guessed born or made. Which is it, Autumn? Born or made? No, of course you don't know. Nobody knows because it's a dumb question, guest. You should have said, instead, guest should have said, instead of asking these silly questions sometimes, I wish he would just tell us the answer, which is, no, it's not one or the other. Men, women, everybody are both born and made. We are biological. We're always biological and we are always cultural all at the same time. We're born and made all together, simultaneously. So anthropologists and other social scientists have separated out as we know, the ideas of sex and gender in order to kind of talk about the biological and the cultural aspects of this. That sex refers to the biological and physical differences that we can see, perceive, describe biologically, whereas gender refers to the social roles, ideas, expectations that we have of people that we believe are a certain physical or biological sex. Very important innovation, I think mostly brought to us, again, mostly brought to us by the feminists in the 1970s who were able to separate out these two characteristics. And this led to the idea that a number of you were drawn to, which is the idea of the cultural construction of gender. That we can look at different societies and different historical time periods and see how there were different ideas, expectations, roles over time, that gender is not something that is fixed for all time, but is something that we build up. Now, when we say it's culturally constructed, I want to be clear about two things. First of all, that doesn't mean that there are no biological differences. People get confused. It's kind of like race. They're like, ah, oh, there those anthropologists go. They're saying there's no, we're not saying that. We're just saying that it's very important to consider the ideas, roles, imagination, expectations that we have in society. And so, first of all, that doesn't mean there are no biological differences. Of course, there's a bunch of biological differences between every human being. We'll talk even more about the biology than we probably want to in a second. But there's biological difference. But how much of us are shaped by those cultural expectations? And then on the other hand, people are like, oh, are you saying that gender, this is all a cultural construction? Of course we are. And that means it's very real. That is to say, if something is a cultural or a social construction, that means it is hugely important. And so that's why it's so shaping of our lives. So, Guest talks about a couple things in here that are, super interesting, fascinating potential topics for your second essay when we get around to thinking about that. The idea of how boys and girls differentially participate in youth sports. One of you commented on how, this idea that boys get more coaching, they get more suggestions thrown at them in the sport. So even if you're on a co-ed team, the girls kind of get shunted to the side. And so, this is an interesting way in which this manifests, and a lot of us can relate to it as people who once did youth sports or doing sports. And then there's, this, I like that Guest goes into here the idea of constructing masculinity. A lot of people talk about, cultural expectations of femininity and how women are, but here it's also the case that we need to build up or have certain ideas and roles about being masculine, which are cultural expectations as well. He goes into also here. He talks about the idea of machismo in Mexico, the work of Matthew Gutmann. I talk about that a little bit more in my Peoples and Cultures of Latin America class. I'll just shorten it to say here that one of the things that this research shows with this, there were multiple ways to be what was considered macho or masculine. And the idea that there's only one machismo in Mexico or in Latin America was very much disproven in this work. In recent years, people have started talking about how much gender is something that we perform, that we act out, that we play out. And by saying we play out, I'm not necessarily saying that, again, that it is something that is not real, but that it is something that we must constantly um, be doing actively. And it's something that a lot of us take for granted. But it is also something that is a rather continuous performance. And basically what that means is people have certain ideas about how you should perform, and you're rewarded for performing well, and you're penalized for not performing as you should. And that's how we keep people in line. And so, it was interesting reading about your dress codes in high school, and how I mean, it's a very good example of how a boy and a girl might be wearing the same exact shirt or the same, a similar outfit, and one of them is penalized for it, and one of them is can get away with it, or is even celebrated for dressing in a certain way. So dress is something that we perform, that we do. I ran up and grabbed this shirt for class just to do some gender performance here. I don't know if you know this, but in the old days, in the 1920s or so, um, pink was the color for boys, because apparently red was seen as a masculine color, the male color being red, all fiery and masculine. And so boys were like little men, and so they dressed in pink. And then light blue is actually the color for little girls, because blue was a feminine, cool color. And so, to be on the cooler side of things meant that the little girls should be dressed in blue, in light blue. And so our ideas of pink and blue now, which somehow got flip-flopped from the earlier days, are actually an indication of how this is historically and culturally constructed. Even the colors that we're supposed to be wearing have changed over time. Now, a lot of people came to anthropology, like I said, because of the gender stuff and because of the increasing attention to gender in our own society. But probably, like I said, in the last, this is even getting hotter now. In the last 5 years or so, the understanding that anthropology could also help with understanding not just men and women, boys and girls, but how our very concept of a strict binary category might not be uh, might not be for all time, both in gender and in sex. I actually want to start with the gender part, because that might be easier for some people, maybe most of us, to understand. Uh, and this is the idea that although in our own society we have a binary gender system, or we had, in other societies there might be more than one gender category. And one of the examples are the hijras in Hindu ritual, which Gus discussed uh, as a kind of third gender category. And then very importantly, the idea of a two-spirit person in native North America, or among peoples that were indigenous to the Americas. And so, it turns out that people in the Americas were actually had some very innovative ideas about gender. And so they might have a third gender category, or even a fourth or gender category of people who were biologically of one sex, or biologically perhaps more indeterminate, and then would adopt the gender role of the opposite sex, or would have a sort of a special category that would not even be part of the original gender system. In the anthropological literature, there was a derogatory term that was used for these people that came to us from the French word for a male prostitute. So these were ones, if you read old style anthropology, they're called berdache. We don't use that word anymore because it's derogatory. The people who have been thinking about sort of understanding this role in contemporary indigenous American societies have again talked about this idea of the two-spirit, because it was seen as kind of a special category that went beyond the binary gender ideas. There are some really interesting uh, resources that have been done that show that there are societies all over the world, in fact, that have more than two gender categories have a third or a fourth gender category as well. So the idea, and like I said, I think that anthropology has become a place to go to on these issues, because as we in our own society figure out that we may not all identify gender-wise with only two identifications, and as we start to retitle our toilet stalls and all those kinds of things, this is an example of something that has been true for a long time and has been true in many other societies as well. It's not something that's just new to the United States. Now, the other sort of this is where things get perhaps hmm, perhaps more more complex, or more difficult than many people are ready to go. A lot of people are okay with the idea that there might be more than two genders, that there might be different social roles for those different genders, but there's also been proposed the idea that sex is not necessarily binary either. And one of the key people here is a biologist, Anne Fausto Sterling, who's written about sex gender issues. So she wrote a very famous essay called "The Five Sexes: Why Male and Female Are Not Enough." And she wasn't necessarily proposing that we actually have five categories for sex and that you could accurately sort all individuals into them, but she was drawing our attention to the fact that the biology is not always as clear cut as we might think. Certainly, a lot of people do fall into what we might consider the traditional binary. But when you combine different kinds of chromosomal combinations with different kinds of hormonal combinations, with different kinds of things that people do socially, these categories get a little murkier than they might have been. And we can talk about, people who are born with a condition that is sometimes called intersex, and there's a variety of reasons why people can be born in that condition. It's a more prevalent condition than people realized. So it is present in a number of births. Our traditional approach to this, at least in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s, was just to fix them. People would come out, looking kind of ambiguous, and a doctor would sort of huddle it up and, decide what to do. And so it would do a surgery or some sort of, or try and make a modification and sort of push that person into one role or the other. There's been thankfully, some pushback on that from people in the intersex community. Are like, well, let's not just fix them. Let's let this play out a little bit. This may not be as weird as you think it is, and let's let people have some of their own agency in how to decide this. Now, there are certain conditions which are somewhat, biologically, I would say, more obvious than others, where there might be, but there are others that, yeah, maybe we should just let it run for a little bit. Let it be for a second. Don't get so binary on us. So, like I said, there's a very, like Guest mentions the article by Fausto Sterling that talks about the five sexes. She wasn't actually arguing for a strict categorization into five sexes, but it certainly is true that the idea that there are only two and that there's only a binary system is being questioned or adjusted in today's world. Questions up till now? Ah, yes. Gender and power. Or as I wanted to title this chapter, Gender and Sexism, right? So this is our traditional uh, guest structuring, where we start off with the race, and then we go into race and power. We start off with culture and then go into culture and power, et cetera. So now in the latter part of the chapter, Guest goes into ideas about gender and power. So one of the things he talks about here is the idea about the assumption of male dominance. And so, like I said, there was a questioning of these categories in the 1970s by a number of feminist anthropologists. And one of the things that, that, that certain feminist anthropologists were looking for is why it seemed like when you looked around the world, male dominance was something that occurred in so many different societies. And so the anthropologist Sherry Ortner came up with this very interesting formulation. Man is to culture as woman is to nature. So that's what that means. And what she was saying, which was super fascinating, I think, right, is that we associate men with the cultural side of things, with the political side of things, with the economic side of things, with the arts, with power, with social relationships. So our stereotypes about men in many different societies has to do with this public cultural association. Whereas our stereotypes about women, we associate them with, homes and babies and feeding and all sorts of natural, what we might consider natural or biological activities. And so, like I said, expressed as a mathematical or a logical formula, man is to culture as woman is to nature. And what Ortner was saying is that this held true in all kinds of different societies. And like I said, it was a fascinating idea. I think it was a very important and inspirational idea, and it was helpful in getting people to think about, well, why exactly are men seen as dominant in so many different societies? Um, as Gus says here, eventually anthropologists were like, wait a second. There are so many places where men are more associated with the natural and women are associated with the cultural. And there's a lot of different places where these categories don't even make sense because the whole opposition of culture and nature is actually a Western assumption anyway. Suffice it to say that, that this formula was inspiring, but didn't kind of hold up over time as sort of the source or the sort of primordial reason for male dominance. But super interesting, super neat to take a look at it. The idea of gender stereotypes, what some of you talked about, sort of, which go with the clothing thing that, certain, that, as you know from your dress codes in high school, that apparently if, the boys see a little too much skin, it's gonna, I don't know what they're gonna do. They can't study, they can't read, won't be able to pay attention in class. So stereotypes about, how people react to certain things, gender ideologies, who should be in charge of things, and stratification, as we all know, some of the differentials in terms of the economic and political stratification. You can see a lot of these on display if we turn on our televisions and see people playing with these right now in the Senate. One of the things that Guest mentions here is a super fascinating article by the anthropologist Emily Martin called "The Egg and the Sperm," and this was written, I believe, it comes up a lot in gender studies classes. It's kind of a classic. This was written in 1991, and if you ever, it's been reprinted everywhere. So if you ever get a chance to read it, it's pretty fascinating. What she did was she looked at sort of biological textbooks and how they described these biological functions and what was going on. And it was amazing how much our gender ideology entered into this textbook explanation. So that, the actions of the sperm were always taken as sort of aggressive and praised, and the egg was sitting there all passive and waiting to be conquested. So, it was trying to tell us how our gender ideology enters into even these sort of what should be neutral descriptions of biology in our science textbooks. And then of particular importance, I think, for anthropology The idea of, so there was a long time that we had this idea of man the hunter as being extremely important in the development of our species. And so there's this sort of glorification of man the hunter. And, then there was a while that the anthropologists were like, wait a second, the importance of woman the gatherer, and it's actually women who gather most of the food and the most of the calories for many of these hunting and gathering groups. So there's an attempt to rebalance some of these things. I think Gus even goes beyond that to say that, in fact, there's a lot of men who were gathering in these societies, and there's nothing necessarily biologically to prevent women from hunting. So there's something that I try to talk about in my own intro to anthropology classes. We just got done with that section on trying to get away from some of the stereotypes about, what was happening during the caveman days. Turns out people weren't living in caves anyway, because that would be a stupid place to live. And, this idea that these were male-dominated, hunting-dominated societies are also suspect. So we've kind of gone back and really revised the idea that there's any sort of historical or archaeological evidence for male-dominated activities. I think this is a fairly recent tweet from Archaeology and Women, which is like, yeah, well, we're always giving women the credit for ceramics and basketry, but why don't we acknowledge them for stone tools? And as it turns out, if we look ethnographically at some of the evidence from around the world, a lot of times it's the women who are making and using stone tools. So even this idea of the stone tools, which we often ascribe to men and kind of take that back 3 million years or so, may have actually been women as well, or maybe they had a whole different gender alignment anyway. It is, I think that eventually, we're going to look back to the 10,000 year ago past or the 300,000 year ago past and think, well, there's no reason to believe that they had gender binaries like we do today. Oh, that's it. That was the tweet. Oh, good. Cool. That's a good place. Comments, questions? All right then. Thanks. Sexuality for Wednesday. More fun.
Have a nice day.
Take care.